Well, here we are again. The fact that we're here today proves, if nothing else, Songbird wasn't a fluke, and I can indeed write a second book. I'm sorry if the light is a little wonky. I am upstairs because the dining room just isn't working today. There may be a little reflection on my glasses. I don't really want to look at the screen too much and see, so hopefully you won't get a blue glare. Okay, back to our regularly scheduled program. Songbird will always have a special place in my heart because it was my first book, and I've lived with these characters for a long, long time. A Wider World wasn't what I had planned to write as a follow-up. I had started a book set in the 1930s, and for those who were interested, I'm still working on it, and it will happen. But as I was trying to work on that book, I heard this voice that said, they said I would not end well. And I stopped writing and thought, who said, and did you? And Robin proceeded thoroughly, slowly, carefully to tell me. His story is told in two timelines, one in the present, which for him is 1558, and the other spanning the years 1506 up until it meets with his present day. He was an interesting character to write about. He was a secondary character in Songbird, and he didn't start out well. He was an obnoxious child, and no one liked him. I didn't like him, and I had to write about him. Eventually, he and Bess became friends, and later, when they were older, he again did something that didn't show him in the best light. I think he suggested I write this book simply in order to clear his name and explain himself. Whether he's cleared his name is questionable, but he has certainly explained himself. I've gotten a few questions from Facebook and Twitter, and after the reading is done, I'll answer those. But for now, let's get started. As I said, the book is written in two timelines. When the story opens, Robin has just returned to England after nearly 5 years in exile. Henry VIII is long dead, as is his son Edward. When Catholic Queen Mary came to the throne, Robin, as a Protestant and as someone who was known to have worked for Thomas Cromwell, decided to get out of Dodge before he came to anyone's attention. He comes home just a few days too soon, and after spending one night in his house, the door is kicked in and he's arrested for heresy. We open on the first night of Robin's captivity in the midst of a conversation with his captor. Okay. Chapter 1. Monday, November 10, 1558. Winterset, Yorkshire. They said I would not end well. And so you have not. The young man has an air of self-importance, something he should have outgrown by now. But perhaps not. He has, after all, arrested me. Maybe he should feel arrogant. I walk toward the fire, smiling as he moves out of my way. I did not begin well, I will grant you that. And my middle was middling. The heat warms my face, masking any flush of anger. But my end is not yet accomplished. He speaks again, his confidence recovered. For your nefarious history with Thomas Cromwell, for your role in the destruction of the monasteries and your attempts to dismantle the one true church, for promoting Luther and the English Bible, Her Majesty charges you with heresy. I ignore him. You, who have interrupted my supper with your warrants and demands, who are here to see me to that end, you have no idea of my beginnings. Mongrel, they called me. Bastard. Unloved. I should have withered. I did not. I forced myself to flourish to prove the world wrong. The world did not, early on, consider me of enough importance to care whether I lived or died. Now I have achieved importance in the eyes of some, though only some see my true value. Whether you come to see it remains to be seen. The young man, William Hawkins, snorts. A laugh? A sound of disbelief? He drops into my empty chair, his black boots stretched toward the blaze. I watch him in the small convex mirror which stands on the cupboard, a memento of my Venetian travels just unpacked. You were told I was clever, to beware my words. I do not appear dangerous, do I? A man of 50-odd, dressed in clerical black? Thin to the point of gauntness, though seemingly healthy. A man with few attachments in this life, and those well concealed. I can see you are interested. Hawkins demurs, but his eye stretches at my words, and I continue. The storm will not abate before morning. It is not solely in my own interest that I suggest you ask your men to stand down. Hawkins is unwilling, but sees sense in the end. I try not to listen as he speaks to his men, 9 of them, as if I require an army to be brought to justice. They shed their wet cloaks and settle themselves in the hall. I'll have ale brought out. Their goodwill will be more easily won than my captors. I look at him again. He gives the impression of wearing armor, but in truth he has nothing more than layers of damp wool, like the rest of us, with a well-cut doublet on top to show his status. We may as well pass the evening in conversation. Chapter 2. It is difficult to determine the truth about my parents from what I was told during my childhood. I believe, for example, that my father was a priest who did more than give penance to the young nun who bore me. I know for fact that I was born at Wardlow Priory in Yorkshire. There I was housed with the other foundlings and cared for by the nuns. When I was 4, I was given over to a family who had lost 2 sons to the sweat and were willing to raise a boy of dubious parentage, and, if I am honest, of dubious physical charms as well. I was a sturdy child, but not inclined to work. By 6, I had discovered that the church was a haven where I could hide from my father's temper. The priest found me one day, sniveling in a corner. He dragged me out, stopped my bloody nose with his kerchief, and asked my name. Robin. He cocked his head. Under thick black brows, his eyes were gray, nearly the same shade as my father's, but kind. Who were your parents? My nose tickled as more blood made its way down. We lived top of the hill, the falling down alehouse. Most of the houses in the village looked to be falling down, but I knew no other way to describe my home. Wife, he asked. Your father is Timothy Wife? I nodded. He led me outside to the well, his dusty black skirts flapping around his legs, and brought up the dipper. Why have I never seen you at school? Or at Mass? The water was so cold it pained my eyes. I'm not meant to, I said. I help with the brewing. I was usually tied to a post in the brewing shed. As little as I liked it, it didn't seem worth mentioning. Father Gideon considered me. You're a well-spoken lad. You should be in school, at least for a few years. My eyes grew large. The idea of telling my father, who loomed enormous in his tattered smock and equally frayed temper, was terrifying. I handed Father Gideon the dipper and sprinted down the lane toward our falling-down house. It was more than a week before Father Gideon turned up at the alehouse door. Mother was tending a pot over the fire, and Father sat on a nearby bench with a mug of ale. My sisters, 2 older and 1 younger, were sewing by the window in the fading light. There were no customers. After an outburst, the men stayed away for a day or 2, but were drawn back eventually by the lure of cheap drink. He's going to want feeding. My father shoved back the bench. Hide the meat. One of my sisters scurried to do his bidding, and then the 4 of us retreated into the shed. Will he eat all our food? Little Mary asked. He's almost as big as Father. Worry more that Father will fight him. Esther was my middle sister, almost 10, and she was the only person in the house that I loved. She had long brown braids that got covered in burrs when we went foraging together, and she let me pick them off. None of the others liked me to touch them. Dorcas, the eldest, tried never to look at me. Was it because she missed her brothers? I had never asked. We huddled in the fetid straw, listening to the murmur of adult voices, smelling the food we could not eat. Finally, Father Gideon passed by in the lane, and we shifted our cramped limbs. Dorcas picked up Mary, who had fallen asleep, but before she could pass into the house, Father's bulk filled the doorway. He hauled me up by my shirt. The priest says you're to go to school. His sour ale breath filled my senses, and I was afraid he would beat me so that I couldn't go to the school. Instead of striking me, he shook me like a rag and threw me to the ground. You'll go, but you'll earn the privilege. No supper for you. Stay out here and think about your fine chances. I stayed in the cold shed all that night, my stomach rumbling, wondering what Father Gideon had gotten me into. Did I need another reason for my father to abuse me? What chances did I have, and why did I deserve any? My mother told me often enough that they'd gotten a bad deal when they took me, wanting a strong boy to replace their dead sons and getting me instead, a lazy, disappointing dolt only fit to fetch water and stare at barrels. I dozed near dawn and was awakened by a chicken that had found its way inside. It fluttered and clucked, then burrowed into the straw. I listened to the familiar sounds, and when it squawked once, loudly, I reached out and snatched the egg. The shell was warm, and the egg, which I cracked straight into my mouth, was hot and greasy, but it took away the worst of my hunger. Chapter 3. Monday, November 10, 1558. Winterset, Yorkshire. Hawkins still wears his sword, but he has left his cloak and hat downstairs. There's a very fine dagger at his belt. I have decided to placate him. As much as I dislike your errand, I'm glad you got here before the storm struck. I would not want anyone out in such a gale. The weather on the coast was extreme. Our brief summers were glorious, but winter started earlier each year. Your men are comfortable, bedded down in the hall? He nods, his expression less cocksure than earlier. Spending the night was not part of his plan. They're well enough. I'm glad of it. They're young and have ridden far. They will sleep. We're not likely to, not with the rain lashing the windows so they rattle in their frames, not with the threat of execution banging around in my brain. Settling into a seat across from me, he says, "This is severe for November. We get the sea storms. When the wind subsides, I can hear, just faintly, the crashing of the waves. I'm expecting my wife any day. I imagine the storm will delay her as it holds us here. I estimate how far he can be pushed. I don't suppose you'd consider waiting." "No." "I thought not. I cannot just vanish. I will write a letter once he falls asleep." He looks around my bedchamber, where we have removed to get away from the snores and mutters of his men. This is a small room. In a northern house, warmth is more important than show, I say. It contains everything I need to make a life, if I am to be permitted one. Those last few days on the Unicorn, I dreamed of this room. I rarely remember my dreams, but these were clear, and yet so very ordinary. Dreams of my bed with its heavy green curtains, a fire in the hearth, and a bowl of late apples on the table, lending their cider scent to the air. My tastes, despite appearances, are simple. If we cannot sleep, we may as well drink. Hawkins looks in dire need of something, presented as he is with a willing captive, but weather that bars the door. May I call my servant? Sebastian only sleeps when I go to rest. He nods. I decide to push him, just a bit. You have the look of your parents about you. His blue eyes widen. You know them? I knew them both. In his youth, your father was strong for Queen Anne. Did your mother convince him to change sides, or did he simply dance to the king's tune, as we all did, and end on the right foot when the music stopped? Even in the dim room, I can see him flush. He's got her skin as well as her eyes. My mother's dead. Don't slander her. I hadn't heard of her death, but why would I? For the last few years, I only kept up with news that touched my own life and my eventual return. She was a fine woman, I tell him. Give your father my condolences. I doubt I shall see him, unless he has become constable of the Tower, which I do not think is in his remit. He's probably here in Yorkshire, at one of his manors, waiting with his head down, as all sensible men are, to see what happens next. Sebastian appears. He's been outside the door, waiting for my call, hoping to defend me from this undangerous young man. Bring us some wine, will you, Seb? My captor looks away from the fire. I don't want wine. I hope your men have left some ale, then. My uncle keeps a stock of perry, if you'd rather. I look to Seb for confirmation. I drink wine. His lip comes out, truculent. I just don't like it much. Was I this callow and easily offended at 25? We all have our preferences. I had no intention of slighting you. You're certainly accustomed to wine. We've just discussed your bloodline. Seb shuffles his feet in the rushes. He will toss Hawkins through the shuttered window at a word from me. Instead, I say, bring a jug of wine for me and some bread and cheese to toast over the fire, and some ale for my friend. With a disappointed glance, he disappears. I'm not your friend. I do not rise to his bait. You object to the term? How then should I address you? As my enemy? My adversary? You're young, but I would not call you my inferior. I stretch my hands out toward the fire. The damp makes my joints stiff. I prefer friend. I've had few enough of them in my time. I'm trying to improve my standing in the eyes of God as I get closer to meeting him. And that's chapters 1 through 3. You've gotten a little bit of Robin, a little bit of his captor Will, and a little bit of the past that makes him who he becomes. And now for the questions. I got a few on Twitter and Facebook, so let's go with those. I can't see the phone well enough to see if there are any live questions. If there are, I promise I will answer them later. Question 1. Of all the characters in Songbird, what made you pick awkward, prickly Robin as the protagonist of your second book? I think I covered this earlier when I said I don't think I picked him. He chose me. He annoyed the hell out of me in Songbird, but it ended up being interesting exploring what happened that made him that way. And a follow-up, where does Robin's personality come from? Was he inspired by any particular historical figure? Robin is thoroughly his own person. Some traits carried over from Songbird, and I expanded on them, but the rest came from the life he lived on the page. Any bit of his personality inspired by historical figures is the same part of anyone from that day and age, living in response to the times they were in. He was very closed and private because it was often dangerous to let people know who you really were, especially when your identity isn't quite the accepted norm. This is a good one. Given that you didn't plan to write a series, is it difficult to create backstory when you're already tied to what appeared in the previous books? I didn't plan to write a series. I don't always like series, and I solved that dilemma by writing what I call a not sequel, which is this. I took a secondary character from Songbird and continued on with his story. And I'm thankful I left myself some crumbs to work from. Robin started in Wolsey's choir. He went to Oxford to be educated. He traveled to Italy afterward, where he became ill and lost his singing voice. And he returned to court to work for Cardinal Wolsey again. I even mentioned that he was currying favor with Cromwell at the end of Songbird. All these facts were helpful when I began to plan a wider world. In a review of Songbird, I got a comment that while they enjoyed the epilogue, they would have appreciated knowing what happened to Bess and Tom in the years before 1559 when the epilogue took place. The problem was, at the time, I didn't know. So there are Bess and Tom appearances in a wider world, both for their fans and for my own enjoyment, and also because their story overlapped with Robin's. And there will be more in my next book, which follows immediately upon a wider world and is tentatively called Lady in Waiting. That book will be out in April 2022. So I've done it again. Another question. The structure of your story lends itself to comparisons with 1001 Nights. Did you start out with this in mind, or did you realize the similarities later? That's a good one. I didn't start out with the structure, but it came to me pretty quickly. The original idea had Robin's present dilemma bracketing the beginning and ending of the story. That didn't last long, as the every other chapter theory appealed far more, with Robin both taunting and becoming closer to his captor, and using stories to distract him and to slow their journey, and hopefully to remind him of his humanity. I hadn't planned to mention 1001 Nights at all, but when doing some research about books published during the period, which was a fun side research journey because Robin's a book hound and I got to look up what he would have been reading, I discovered that it was actually known, at least in Syria, by the late 1400s. From there, it seemed plausible that a translated version could have made it to Venice in time for Robin to read it, and he then translated it from Italian to English. It would have been fresh in his mind when presented with his own approaching execution, and he would have thought replicating it was well worth the attempt. And there we have it, folks. A wider world, the tale of my choir boy turned secretary turned heretic with a few other things in between. I hope you enjoy him as much as I enjoyed writing about him. For those who buy ebooks, your copy will appear magically on your devices at midnight. For paper book lovers, it should be in your hands within a few days. And as always, I want to remind you that reviews are how authors get by in this world. In addition to feeding our very souls, they let other readers know that our books are worth buying. So if you've read Songbird or are planning to read A Wider World, I encourage you to leave a review on Amazon or Goodreads or whatever platform you purchased your book. This doesn't just go for me, especially if it's an indie book or published by a small press. That few minutes of your time will make a huge difference in the life of a book. That is all for now. Thank you all for stopping by. I hope you enjoy A Wider World, and this time next year I'll be back with another book. Bye.